As the golden hues of sunset bathed the deserted road, Elias Harrington, a tall, imposing black man exuding confidence and authority, sat behind the wheel of his sleek black sedan, cruising effortlessly along the empty street. At 47, he was dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his official license plate reflecting the immense power he wielded. Yet behind his sharp gaze lay the weariness of a man who had spent the entire day navigating the relentless challenges of justice. After an intense meeting with local officials, he longed for nothing more than to return home and find solace with his family. But would tonight's journey be as peaceful as he had hoped? The answer came swiftly, ripping through the quiet evening like a blade and ear-splitting siren blared from the rearview mirror. A police car sped up behind him, red and blue lights flashing in rapid succession. Elias furrowed his brows, watching the approaching vehicle before signaling and pulling over. He had no idea why he was being stopped. His speed was within the limit. His paperwork was in order, and there was nothing remotely suspicious about his luxury car. As he reached for his wallet, a familiar tension gripped him. He knew that, as a black man, even as the governor of the state, every traffic stop carried an unpredictable risk, a test of both his power and his dignity. A white police officer, his name tag reading Wade Thornton, approached the vehicle. His hand rested firmly on the grip of his holstered gun, his steps slow, deliberate, and radiating hostility. Elias could tell this was no routine stop. "License and registration," Officer Thornton demanded, his sharp gaze scanning Elias from head to toe. "Who are you to be driving this kind of car?" Elias held his composure, his expression calm yet unyielding as he raised an eyebrow. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Thornton's grip on his gun tightened as he barked, "Don't play dumb with me. Step out of the car. Now." Elias Harrington remained steady, though his mind raced. This was not about a traffic violation, this was something far worse. He unlatched the door and stepped out, his towering frame overshadowing the officer before him. Yet, he made no sudden movements, no gestures of defiance. Thornton's eyes narrowed, and then the words came laced with contempt, dripping with venom. "People like you don't deserve to drive a car like this." Elias' heart pounded, but he did not flinch. This was not the first time he had encountered such blatant discrimination. But what Thornton didn't realize was that tonight he wasn't dealing with an ordinary target. Tonight he was standing before Governor Elias Harrington. Another officer, Austin Whitman, scowled, his hand hovering dangerously close to his gun as he barked out a command. "Put your hands on the hood." Elias slowly crossed his arms over his chest, his voice even yet razor sharp. "I will cooperate, but I have the right to know why I'm being stopped. Am I being detained?" Whitman smirked, arrogance etched across his face. "Who do you think you are, talking to me like that? Wearing a fancy suit, driving an expensive car, don't try to tell me you earned that money legally." Elias let out a quiet, restrained chuckle, keeping his rising anger in check. "Hard work and dedication can do wonders, officer. You should try it sometime." Thornton's eyes darkened with fury as he stepped forward, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "Watch yourself, boy. You're not as untouchable as you think." Elias tilted his head slightly, scrutinizing the officer before responding, his tone calm yet commanding. "Is this how you uphold the law, officer?" Whitman said nothing. Instead, he pointed toward the car and barked another order. "Open the trunk. Let's see what you're hiding in there." Elias remained still, unshaken, unmoving, as solid as a stone. "Do you have a search warrant, officer?" Thornton's face darkened instantly, his smug expression replaced by pure anger. "I don't need a search warrant," he barked. "When there's reasonable suspicion, I can act immediately. And the fact that someone like you is standing here in an expensive suit, thinking you can look down on me, is reason enough for me to act." A slow smile spread across Elias's lips, not one of amusement, but a warning. "Interesting. A rather creative interpretation of the law, but I'd advise you to be careful. You're standing on very dangerous ground." Thornton raised an eyebrow, mistaking Elias's calmness for submission. He stepped closer, his chest heaving with anger. "I told you to open the trunk," Thornton roared. "Or are you resisting?" Elias didn't blink, his gaze as sharp as a blade. I know my rights. And unless you have a valid search warrant, I won't be opening my trunk today." Thornton took a deep breath, his fists clenching. He was used to giving orders and having them obeyed, especially when the person on the receiving end was someone like Elias. But now, he was facing a man who refused to back down. "Listen here, boy," Thornton growled. "Out here I am the law, and if you don't cooperate, I will." Elias cut him off, his voice cold as steel. "You will what? Arrest me for knowing my rights? Or is this about something else you're too afraid to say out loud?" Thornton faltered for a split second, his arrogance wavering. But instead of backing down, he grabbed his radio. "You've got a big mouth," Thornton hissed. "Maybe I should call for backup. I bet if we search thoroughly, we'll find something." Elias held his gaze unshaken. "Go ahead," he said, his voice eerily calm. "In fact, I encourage it. The more witnesses, the better." Elias's confidence made Thornton hesitate, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He pressed the radio button. "I have a situation requiring backup," Thornton said, his eyes never leaving Elias. Then, as if he had run out of patience, Officer Wade Thornton lunged forward and delivered a vicious kick to Elias Harrington's stomach. Elias felt the impact but didn't stumble. He took a deep breath, planting his feet firmly. The pain only sharpened his focus. Thornton, seeing Elias still standing, followed up with a powerful punch aimed at his face. But Elias moved swiftly, tilting his head just in time to evade the blow, his eyes now blazing with fury. Seizing the moment, Elias swung his right fist, landing a solid punch to Thornton's chest, forcing him to stagger backward. The patience had run dry. This was a fight now. Thornton tried to raise his arms to defend himself, but Elias surged forward, delivering a crushing left hook to his face. The officer wobbled but quickly regained his balance. At this moment, Elias tilted his head slightly, as if assessing a pitiful man who had just pushed himself into disaster. Thornton opened his mouth to say more, but Elias had already pulled out his phone, quickly scrolling through his contacts before pressing call. The situation was beyond saving, and this call would put an end to everything. "I think it's best to inform a few of my friends." Elias's voice was calm, yet carried a weight that made Thornton suddenly fall silent. When the call connected, Elias spoke clearly. "This is Governor Elias Harrington. I'm being harassed by an officer named Wade Thornton in an unjustified traffic stop. I request immediate representation from the Attorney General's office." All color drained from Thornton's face, leaving only the pale complexion of a man who had just realized he had destroyed his career in a few foolish minutes. The radio in his hand crackled, signaling that backup was on the way. But at this moment, no one could help him. No one could save a man who had dug his own grave. A few minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the highway, and the commanding sound of patrol cars echoed through the night. Two officers stepped out, their faces stiffening as they recognized the man Thornton had just tried to humiliate. "Governor Elias Harrington?" One of them spoke, his voice filled with respect. Elias gave a slight nod. "That's correct. I believe you'll want to review Officer Thornton's actions here." Whitman swallowed hard, his eyes darting in panic. He took a step back as if hoping to disappear into the darkness, but it was too late. The lesson he learned: prejudice always comes with a price, and today the price was his career. Just then, another police car sped onto the scene, its lights flashing against the still night. The moment it stopped, the door swung open, and from it emerged Police Chief Camille Davenport. She was tall, with a strong, commanding presence. The crispness of her uniform only added to her authority. Her sharp eyes quickly scanned the scene before settling on the pale face of Wade Thornton. With an air of absolute control, Camille strode forward, each step radiating confidence and dominance. She stopped right in front of the flustered officer, her icy blue eyes locking onto him without blinking. "Officer Thornton," Camille spoke, her voice steady, not loud, but carrying the weight of an order that could not be ignored. "Did you just pull over Governor Harrington without just cause?" Wade Thornton felt his throat go dry. A cold sweat began to bead on his forehead, despite the cool night air. He tried to steady himself, but the panic in his eyes was impossible to hide. Austin Whitman, the officer who had assisted Thornton, also took a step back, his face turning ghostly white, as he realized he had walked straight into a disaster. I didn't know who he was," Thornton stammered, his voice trembling. "He was driving a luxury car, and I thought." "You thought?" Elias Harrington cut in, his voice as sharp as a freshly forged blade. "You thought you had the right to judge me based solely on appearances. You didn't ask, you didn't verify, you simply assumed." The air grew thick with tension, nearly suffocating. Bystanders had stopped to watch, sensing the storm that was about to break. Sheriff Davenport didn't take her eyes off Thornton, but her voice remained professional. "Governor Harrington," she said, turning to Elias with a tone of respect. "On behalf of the police department, I sincerely apologize. This is not how we operate, and it is certainly not something I tolerate within my force." Elias studied Camille for a long moment as if assessing whether her words were truly sincere. He gave a slight nod, but his gaze remained sharp. "I appreciate the apology," Elias said slowly, "but it does not address the root of the problem. This isn't just about me. How many others have been treated this way by Wade Thornton? How many people had no power or status to push back against his actions?" His words struck like a hammer against a brutal reality. A heavy silence settled over the street. No one dared to speak. No one could deny the truth he had just laid bare. Thornton lowered his head, his hand unconsciously gripping the strap of his duty belt. But he knew this battle was already lost. Officer Wade Thornton glanced downward, shame flickering in his eyes, mixed with a hint of frustration. He opened his mouth, about to say something. But one sharp look from Sheriff Camille Davenport shut him up immediately. "We need to take this matter back to the station," Sheriff Davenport said firmly, her tone authoritative yet professional. "Governor, if you wish to file an official complaint, we will ensure it is handled with the utmost seriousness." Elias Harrington nodded, his voice unwavering. "Oh, I will be filing a complaint. But this isn't just about paperwork. This is about accountability and justice." Wade Thornton looked as if he wanted to disappear. His shoulders were stiff, his hands clenched around his belt as if trying to cling to the last remnants of his authority. But Elias Harrington wasn't finished. He stepped forward, each slow, deliberate movement exuding dominance like a predator closing in on its prey. His voice was low, but the weight of his words silenced everyone. "Listen carefully, Officer Wade Thornton. That badge on your chest is not a shield to hide your prejudice behind, nor is it a tool to abuse your power. It stands for justice, for protection, and for serving the people, all of which you have betrayed. And now, everyone will see exactly how wrong you were." A cold wind swept through the street, yet the air felt thick with tension. The surrounding officers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting. At first, some may have thought this was just a minor misunderstanding, but now they realized this wasn't just a routine traffic stop. This was a serious failure, a stain that could not be erased. Thornton swallowed hard, feeling as though his throat was tightening. His eyes darted around, searching the faces of those present: Sheriff Camille Davenport, her expression unreadable, his fellow officers, now looking at him with uncertainty, and the bystanders who had gathered, phones in hand, most likely recording every second of this moment. Elias took one more step closer, now standing directly in front of Thornton. His voice remained calm, but it was as sharp as a blade fresh from the forge. "Wade, do you even know what a police officer's job truly is?" Thornton opened his mouth to respond, but quickly fell silent. What could he possibly say? That he knew a police officer's duty was to protect citizens, uphold justice, and maintain order. But if he said that, he would only be exposing himself, because he had never truly done any of those things. The air around them was thick with silence, as if the entire world was waiting for his answer. But all Thornton could do was stand there, head bowed, shoulders trembling. Elias let out a quiet chuckle, one devoid of humor, filled only with disappointment and contempt. "That's exactly the problem, Thornton. You wear that uniform, but you don't understand what it truly means. And that is why, today, everyone will witness the consequences of your actions." He didn't stop there. His gaze remained locked onto Thornton. "Let me tell you, a police officer exists to protect, to serve, and to ensure justice for everyone, Not just for people like you. Not just for those you deem worthy. Sheriff Camille Davenport, standing nearby, gave a subtle nod as if she too could feel the anger in Elias's voice. Thornton, on the other hand, clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. Elias could see the internal struggle of a man desperately trying to hold onto a power he had no right to abuse. At that moment, something inside Wade Thornton seemed to snap. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice laced with frustration. "I was just doing my job. I didn't know who he was. How was I supposed to?" Elias cut him off, his voice cracking through the air like a whip. "You didn't need to know who I was. You just needed to treat me like a human being, one who deserves respect and protection. And you failed." He didn't give Thornton a chance to argue further. Stepping even closer, his voice dropped, but every word carried the weight of a verdict. "Your job is to protect, not to judge. You are not a judge, not a jury. And you certainly don't have the right to strip others of their dignity based on your own flawed judgment." Austin Whitman stood frozen, stiff as a statue, but there was nothing commanding about his posture now. His face had gone pale, his hands clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms, as if he could somehow hold onto the power slipping from his grasp. But he knew this was beyond his control now. The silence that surrounded him was not a comfortable one. It was crushing, suffocating, like the calm before a storm ready to explode. He had no excuses to offer, no justification that could undo what had been laid bare. Everyone had seen. There was no denying it. Humiliation burned through him, creeping into every fiber of his being like wildfire. He had been used to controlling the situation, used to holding authority, used to never being questioned. But now there was nothing left to hold on to. The other officers stood around in silence. Some looked down at the ground, avoiding Elias Harrington's gaze, while others stared at Whitman. But no one spoke in his defense. No one stepped forward to protect him. No one claimed it was just a misunderstanding. Because they knew this wasn't an impulsive act. This wasn't a single, isolated mistake. This was a symptom of something far deeper, of a system that had operated this way for far too long. Some of the officers had likely done the same before. Others had likely witnessed it and turned a blind eye. But today, everything has changed. Today, they could no longer pretend they didn't see. They realized this wasn't just about Whitman. This was about the entire system, a system that was supposed to uphold justice, yet instead had allowed discrimination, prejudice, and abuse of power to flourish. No one dared to say a word, because if they did, they would have to face the truth. A truth they had long ignored. "You were wrong, Wade," Elias continued, his voice steady, cold, and sharp as a blade. "You don't get to treat people differently just because they're not like you, especially when you know nothing about them. But now, you're going to learn a hard lesson." Whitman lowered his head, shame etched across his face. He understood the truth Elias was forcing him to confront. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. A painful reckoning of power, injustice, and long-standing prejudice within the system. Elias took a deep breath, stepping back slightly, his gaze on Thornton devoid of any sympathy. "And remember this, Wade," Elias said, his voice low but firm with warning. "No one escapes accountability when they abuse their power. No one." Whitman stood frozen, his face tight with a mix of anger and fear. The tension in the air had reached its peak, but in that very moment, a piece of justice had been restored. Suddenly, Elias turned to Camille Davenport and said with unwavering authority, "Strip him of his badge and gun." Immediately. Camille Davenport didn't hesitate for a second. She reached out and took Thornton's badge and firearm. "You are no longer worthy of this authority, this badge, or this uniform," she stated, her voice firm and cold. Whitman stood motionless, unable to process what was happening. Elias looked him straight in the eye and declared, "You will be investigated. Let this be a lesson to anyone who dares to abuse their power." The officers around them remained silent, understanding that justice was finally being served. Elias turned to leave, but before walking away, he left them with one final, unwavering statement. Justice will never be silenced. Under the dim glow of the streetlights, Elias Harrington strode away from the scene, leaving behind an air of tension and stunned silence. What he had just done was not merely confronting an officer who abused his power, it was standing against a system that had enabled men like Wade Thornton for far too long. His breath was still heavy, his body tense from the lingering surge of anger. But deep down, he knew this was just a small battle in a much larger war. Elias lifted a hand to rub his temple, his gaze lost in the distance. How many times in his life had he faced moments like this? How many times had he been judged, doubted, simply because of the color of his skin? And how many others had endured the same, suffering in silence with no one to stand up for them? A light breeze swept past, but it did nothing to cool the fire still burning inside him. He thought of his wife, his children, and the people he loved. He couldn't let the next generation grow up in a world where justice was nothing more than a distant ideal, warped by those who misused their authority. The phone in his pocket vibrated. He pulled it out and saw a message from Camille Davenport. "I'll make sure he's fully investigated. We can't let this get buried." He nodded slightly, feeling a small sense of relief. At least he wasn't fighting this battle alone. A few minutes later, Elias stepped into his car, sitting in silence for a moment before starting the engine. As he glanced into the rearview mirror, he saw his own reflection: a black man, a father, a husband, a man who still believed in justice. And he knew this was not the end. This was only the beginning. In the end, Elias's story is not just a battle against injustice, it is a powerful reminder that justice does not come naturally. It requires courage, perseverance, and an unwavering stance against wrongdoing. We cannot simply stand by and hope the world will change. Each of us must be part of that change. So what can we do today, in 2025, and in the years to come? It all starts with small actions: speaking up when we witness injustice, listening to the voices that have long been silenced, and most importantly, treating one another with respect and dignity. Justice is not some distant ideal, it is built, piece by piece, through the choices we make every single day. Looking ahead, we must remember that this fight is not only for those who suffer injustice, it is for everyone who believes in a fairer world. If enough people stand up, those who abuse power will have nowhere to hide. If enough people fight for what is right, future generations will no longer have to live in fear or oppression. And now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about Elias's story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something similar? If you were in his shoes, what would you have done? Your opinion matters, and your story is valuable because conversations like this shape the world we live in. As for me, I believe that justice is never truly defeated, but it needs people willing to defend it. It needs those who refuse to remain silent, those who believe in the power of truth and responsibility. And if there is one lesson this story teaches us, it is this: the time to act is not tomorrow, not someday in the future, but right now. So are you ready to be one of those people? This story is entirely fictional and was created to raise awareness about important social issues. It is not intended to target or reflect any specific individual or organization, but rather serves as a reminder of human responsibility, justice, and ethics. Through this story, we aim to emphasize the importance of treating all people with respect, compassion, and dignity, regardless of who they are or where they come from. We strongly oppose all forms of violence, prejudice, and injustice. Inequality does not exist only in history books or hidden corners of the past, it persists in everyday life. That is why we must continue to confront it, speak out, and take action toward a more just society. Viewers should consider this content carefully, as it may evoke strong emotions. But sometimes, it is these very emotions that push us to reflect, to examine ourselves and the society around us, and to create meaningful change. We hope this story is not just a wake-up call, but also an inspiration for all of us to work together in building a better world.